ensure that progressives take power and stay in power as well. This is a transatlantic one-on-one with Clive Lewis, MP from the United Kingdom, and Megan Day, staff writer for The Jacobin, the leading socialist magazine on politics, economics, and culture in the United States. Enjoy.
Good afternoon. Thanks for showing up to this panel at the Progressive Governance Digital Summit 2021. My name is Lauren Bellhorn, and I am an editor with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which co-designed this panel, and I will be moderating today's discussion. The title of our discussion today is Progressive Majorities, Best Practices on Keeping Out the Center-Right. And the framing for our discussion is that as a new generation of young progressives, center-left and left-wing political parties win seats across Europe and even in the United States, at least slowly takes congressional seats, we're increasingly forced to take seriously the question of how we can both win progressive majorities or win electoral and social majorities for progressive change, but then also implement impactful policy and maintain those majorities so that the progress we make isn't rolled back in the next electoral cycle. Both the center-left and the left itself needs more consensus on how we can address a number of issues ranging from the climate crisis to inequality, and how we can build majorities in government, but also in movements on the street, and develop strategies to ensure that the progress is real. We have two great guests today that I'd like to introduce. Our first is Megan Day, a staff writer at Jacobin magazine, where most of her work can be read, but she's also appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Vox, N+1, The Baffler, and a number of other publications. And she's also the co-author, together with Micah Utrecht, also of Jacobin, of Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. Our second guest is Clive Lewis. Clive Lewis is an MP for the Labour Party in Norwich South. Before entering Parliament, Clive was the Vice President of the National Union of Students. He was a BBC TV political reporter, as well as an Army Reservist infantry officer who served a combat tour of Afghanistan in 2009. Since entering Parliament, he's been the Shadow Minister for Climate and Energy Change. He's been a Shadow Secretary for the State of Defense, a Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and most recently served as Shadow Minister for the Treasury with a focus on environmental economics and sustainable finance. Now, the way that the panel has ended up being structured today, I think gives us a really, very interesting set of perspectives to discuss when it comes to center-left and left strategy, because both of you are coming from two countries in the Anglophone world, which for a number of years until fairly recently were very much the object of attention for leftists, socialists, and progressives around the world. For leftists and socialists, probably for more positive reasons. For centrists, maybe not so positive. But obviously, I'm talking about the rise of Bernie Sanders in the United States and Jeremy Corbyn's 4-year term as the leader of the Labour Party in the UK, where although both of these candidates or both of these leaders were ultimately defeated, we saw a consolidation and a resurgence of a new militant left wing in what were sort of the traditional, historically center-left parties of those respective political systems. So to kick things off, I would like to ask both of you if you could talk a little bit about now, 1.5 or 2 years after the Bernie and the Corbyn moment, where do you see the left in your respective country? What are some of the issues that you think unify, or maybe some of the issues that also divide the left 2 years on? Maybe Clive, maybe you can start us off.
Okay, so after the defeat of Corbyn, the left, as you would expect, had a bad time. I think the difference for us is that after the Sanders campaign, which ultimately failed, Biden, a centrist, came in, and I know there are various narratives on this. He reached out to a broader swathe of his party, more than many people expected. in my own party, and I have to talk about the Labour Party because the Labour Party historically covers a big section of the left in parliamentary terms. In my own party, my new leader, Keir Starmer, kind of shifted to the right, to a more centrist perspective, and ignored the left. So the left finds itself not in the best of places. I would say it finds itself in a stronger place than it was before Corbyn. But nonetheless, what's happened is parliamentary politics only tell you part of the story about the left. And although the left is somewhat weaker after the fall of Corbyn, what you've seen is a growth, an explosion, if you want, of non-party political movements in the United Kingdom. They've always been there, but I think what Corbynism did, it gave a sense of realization that politics mattered, that you as an individual had a voice and could do something about it, and that hope was possible. And I think that's what Corbynism showed. Now, inside the Labour Party, that's not necessarily the best of places to be at the moment if you're on the left. But out externally, in terms of the movements, in terms of Black Lives Matter, the climate movement, and various other, the renters' unions and so on, we've seen a massive explosion on the left. And the last thing I will say is there is inside the Labour Party a growing realization that our party, the thing that unites, that links both the left here and in the US, I would say, is that we have a political system where we have first past the post electoral systems. And they overwhelmingly punish anything but a two-party system. And that means that the left and the right are forced into homes which don't sit very well. And so a lot of our energy is taken fighting with each other or arguing with each other on the direction of travel this big bus should go. And there's lots of capacity in this bus, because there has to be, but actually you can only ever have kind of one or two, a handful of drivers or directors at the front. And that inevitably means the vast majority of the passengers in the rest of that bus, if they're not in the driving seat, get taken along with it. And there's a lot of backseat driving that goes on. And I think that's why in this country now, there is a big push amongst some on the left, especially in my own party, to move towards a more progressive, proportionate system of voting. That's the big thing at this year's conference. More than 220 constituency Labour parties have pushed for that. And the reason for that, I think, and I'll finish on this, is that people increasingly understand that we need a political realignment. And I think they also understand that our first past the post system overwhelmingly rewards and helps the right of politics, not the left. So that's where we find ourselves at the moment.
Yeah, I'll echo what Clive said about being sort of forced into, having, third-party bids or any sort of independent, progressive political expression. It's difficult for that to materialize in the United States as well as in the UK. And so in the US, we have progressives being forced into a political party that is dominated not just by the center-left, but by, I think, globally speaking, the center-right. Has been sort of fully neoliberalized in a process that began in the 1970s and was more or less complete by the 1990s and stayed that way for several decades until Bernie Sanders ran for president starting in 2015. And suddenly the nation discovered that there was more of an appetite in the base for progressive politics than had been previously assumed. But still, it was like Bernie Sanders was attempting to reverse engineer a mass movement by speaking about the power of mass movements. And so it really kind of started to cohere and come together between 2016 and 2020, which is when you saw, progressive groups are starting to crop up. You had socialist groups. You have the Democratic Socialists of America, for example. You have Sunrise Movement and things like that. Justice Democrats. These are all different from each other, but what they have in common is that they were inspired in the wake of the first Sanders campaign to build some kind of durable institution in the absence of a political party, which is sort of like an independent progressive political party has been missing in American politics for forever. This is where the United States differs from the UK. The Labour Party has its ups and downs. You could talk about, degeneration or co-optation, but the United States has never had anything like a progressive political party. So what we're attempting to do is to build organizations that can sort of serve some of the functions of a political party in the absence of one. Some of the language that you hear about this is the idea of a party surrogate, that it's impossible at the moment for progressives to form our own political party without it being essentially doomed from the outset and probably demoralizing people even further and actually kind of squashing the momentum from Bernie 2016 and Bernie 2020 by, we'll lose terribly and very publicly, and it will actually reinforce the idea that we're not capable of change, right? So what are we going to do? We should build organizations that can serve some of the functions of parties, which include mobilizing members, political education, running our own candidates that are associated with a brand that's distinct from the dominant brand of the Democratic Party, even if in this case they have to run on the Democratic Party ballot line in order to win. So that's been happening, and you've got your sort of typical, progressives like Justice Democrats are operating in that space. And then you've also got people further to the left, like the Democratic Socialists of America, of which I'm a member, also operating in that space and collaborating in many cases. So an example of that collaboration would be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Both of those groups were instrumental in installing her and the rest of the squad into office, and now they've been joined. So it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and now they've been joined by Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, and of course we've still got Bernie Sanders. That's a pretty good grouping. It's a small grouping. It's a pretty small percentage of lawmakers in America, but they tend to command an inordinate amount of media attention, and so they are essentially tasked with a two-front war. They have to actually legislate in a way that's credible, in a way that preserves their credibility, builds the credibility of the left, and actually serves constituents. And they also need to build organizations of the type that I was just talking about. And some of them are doing better than others, but that seems to be the major task going into the post-Bernie era.
Well, let's take it from there. I'm wondering, maybe especially for the American context, but this would be relevant to both Corbyn and Sanders and sort of the left that's emerged in their wake seems to, at least compared to if we look at the 2000s, when I think maybe at least you and I, Megan, were cutting our teeth politically, had a pretty strong focus on kind of bread and butter domestic issues. And I'm wondering now in the post-Bernie, post-Corbyn era, what kind of specific domestic issues do you think that the left can cohere around and win a majority for? Maybe, Megan, you can kick us off this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Bernie Sanders has incredible political instincts, to the extent that the history is a mixture between the objective and the subjective. I think that Bernie has some unique subjective qualities, and one of these is an intuition about what actually speaks to working class people, and another of these is incredible stubbornness in the face of decades of attempts to co-opt him. Similar to Jeremy Corbyn in that way. And so, he kind of created a platform in 2015 that I think is actually a pretty decent template for the left. He expanded on it in 2020 with input from, various sectors of the left. And I think we've refined it over time. But I think we have a pretty good sense of what we ought to be running on and what we ought to be legislating or attempting to work toward legislating. And the main three, I think, are Medicare for all. It's just obvious. It cuts across political lines. The fact that we don't have universal health insurance and therefore universal health care in this country is insane. If you live in another country, you've heard the horror stories from the United States. They're entirely true. Regardless of people's political feeling, this is something that can reach deep into the most intimate parts of their life, into their families and their homes, into painful personal experiences, and really speak to people. And that's why Bernie Sanders has made it his flagship issue, not just because it would help tens or hundreds of millions of people, but because it sort of transcends politics. It's important enough that it actually transcends partisan, factional fighting, and has the tendency to realign and re-scramble our partisan topography for that reason. So Medicare for all. Another one is student debt forgiveness coupled with tuition-free public college and trade school. This is good because it can help create cross-class constituencies. If you put those two demands together, you're speaking both to people who, have worked hard their whole lives and they would love for their children to be able to receive a higher education so they have better job prospects, and that includes trade school, not just college. But they can't afford it because the tuition just keeps going up and up, boxing them out of something like middle class standard of living, right? And at the same time, you've also got people who've actually made it past that kind of middle class threshold, who are living in a precarious state and a state of economic dependence because they're so saddled with student debt. So this pair of demands has the tendency to unite those two segments of the very broad working class, which I think is really useful. And the third one, of course, is a Green New Deal. And you have to pair both in that sense, transformative, bold climate action and a job guarantee. So make it a demand that is about trying to reach full employment while at the same time trying to secure a livable future for people. That one I think is a little further behind in terms of popular appetite in the United States than the other two, but actually when you bundle it with the other two, it becomes more popular. And I think Bernie Sanders did that very effectively in his 2020 campaign. So I'd like to see us continue with those three main planks. And of course, we've got a million other demands, right? And trying to figure out how to articulate them and how many to articulate and how far we should go is kind of the task of progressive coalitions. But I think those three are really critical.
Great, thanks a lot. And maybe Clyde, could you say a couple words what you think the left on your side of the Atlantic should be pursuing? I know obviously the Green New Deal was pretty visible, at least during Corbyn's tenure in Labor. Where do you see the party and the movement going from here?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to listen to Megan because there are so many similarities on the two sides of the Atlantic. The Green New Deal definitely would be one of the key policy things which I think can unite the left. Does unite the left. I mean, I have my own look. The left itself, as you already know, the left is very fragmented here, and even not just in the Labour Party, outside of it, across it. And there are certain things which I think, and when we talk about the left, I'm trying to be as broad as possible because I think in this situation here in the UK we have to be. And so there isn't universal support for this, but my definition of progressive would be you have to answer in the affirmative to two questions. Do you want to see more democracy, not less? And are you prepared to challenge the power of capital? And if you can answer yes to those two, even if it's a kind of this much, on both those answers, then I can work with you. And I think where we are at the moment, for a lot of people on the left, for a lot on the left, that's not good enough. Yeah, it's our way or the highway, and then they will pick a hill to die on. And if you don't agree with this on us with this, then go your separate ways. And there are so many schisms. And we just there's a paper that just came out that I've been involved with this group. It's called. In terms of the right, we divide, they conquer, and it's amplified by our electoral system. And what we see, we've been on the retreat for the last 40 years, and although we've had little fips and surges, we're still on the retreat. And what we need to do is stabilise ourselves and begin to move forward and start to win. Because I think one of the things for us on the left is this kind of, there's this Marxist tradition of the inevitability of socialism, that the innate goodness of human beings will win through in the end. The problem we've got now is that when Marx wrote, there wasn't a ticking clock in terms of the ecological and climate crisis, which there is now, with the rise of technology, with the growth, unparalleled growth of a new gilded age in terms of wealth inequality. That window of opportunity in the 21st century is closing. Speak to most scientists and they will tell you that there's more chances than not that the global civilization won't make it through to the 22nd century. That's just where we are. So from my perspective, the only way that we're going to fix that is socialism. But not everyone, the liberals, the Greens, aren't going to buy into that. But there are certain things, certain values, certain approaches that they can go on board with. And, I think that question of what is a progressive, how do we begin to kind of halt the retreat and take a couple of baby steps forward? And you know what? If they then go their own separate way, can't go any further, then those of us who want to go further, who want to democratize more, who want to reduce the power of capital yet further, we can carry on. But I think that for me is where we're in a bad place at the moment. We need to start taking some steps forward, and we're not doing that. I think the kind of tricky areas that I would look at would be the Green New Deal. The other thing I think which can unite us, and here in the UK, one of the things that we're seeing for the Labour Party is we're seeing the breakup of our working class. And there are now, after 40 years, many of the benefits of living in a kind of a kind of social democratic state where people were given social housing, much of that was sold off under the neoliberal governments of both Margaret Thatcher, and subsequent governments, including under social democratic governments. And that generation have benefited greatly from good pensions, buying their own, often heavily discounted social housing. And what's happened now is that we have a class of people, many of them often older, retiring, who come from the working class, but who now see their material well-being linked to the well-being of capital, and their interests are that of capital. And this is a real problem for us, because our electoral coalition is coming apart at the seams. And often those people, once they have that kind of material security, because they basically make the calculation, I'm going to need this material wealth for my old age. I'm going to need to pass on to my children, because this is the mean wealth, and the billionaires aren't going to be touched. It doesn't make a difference who comes into power; they're not being touched. So it's basically, who's it going to be between me and my assets and my family and my community, or students, migrants, and the precariat, those in insecure working class jobs. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them are choosing to ally themselves with the right. And that's a problem for us. So one of the ways, and I think this is the second one apart from the Green New Deal, one of the ways that you can begin to break some of those people off is by introducing an element of universalism. So universalism in terms of adult social care, so that in your old age, you know that you will be looked after. And I think, that you will, irrelevant of your income, you will have a world-class health and social care service that will look after you in your old age, because it's a big factor for many people in how they vote and how they think about their material well-being. And the great thing about that is it links into the Green New Deal, because we know we need a low-carbon economy. So, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of well-paid health and social care jobs, looking after older people, making this something that's valued, that has a low-carbon impact. So it does two things. It contributes to jobs, it contributes to reducing carbon, and it also means that we can begin to look after people. And with that universalism there, as well as universalism in healthcare, which we more or less have, although it's a fight for it, and universalism in other services, public transport and other areas, I think you can begin to peel people away, give them the security. This is a big issue in the 21st century with the looming climate and ecological crisis. You can offer them security. And I think if you can do that, you can begin to break them away from the right. And I think the third one for me, and this is so critical in so much of what's happening, is democracy. And this divides the left as well, because all of us on the left like to think we're democratic, and we are to varying degrees, but there are different cultures of democracy. And I think one of the things about Corbynism, I think in many ways, will probably be the last time any Labour left leadership produces a manifesto as brilliant as it was, which is about doing socialism to people. And I think in the future, we need a far more democratic, bottom-up socialism, where we enable people. We say the what, and they decide the how. And I think that empowerment, that democratic engagement, rather than a top-down kind of, if you want, Stalinist approach to democracy, which are kind of top-down, we know, a kind of Leninist Stalinist approach to democracy, which is we know what's best and we'll tell you, then I think actually in the future it needs to be from the bottom up, and to empower and enable people to make a difference to their lives and to give them power. Because if you give people power, then they won't give it up. And one of the things we've learned is when we have had Labour governments and we've pulled the levers of the state and delivered things for them, what happens is the right, who overwhelmingly win elections in this country, come in and turn those levers off. And so, that's the funding taps, stop. If you give people power, the ability, whether that's an energy cooperative, whether that's whatever it is, give them actual real power, they're not going to let that go. So I think in the future, democracy, both at the workplace, both in terms of their community, in terms of the power of assets, of community wealth, democracy in terms of transparency and data, in terms of the decisions made. I think there's a big place for deliberative democracy in our democracy now. Representative democracy is great, but it has limitations, because I think once you become a representative like I am, you almost become lifted out of your class and into a kind of separate class of representatives. And I think there are dangers in that. So you can balance that by giving people a real say of their life through more deliberative, direct democracy. So I think these are some of the divisions on the left. They're not just between the left and the right, but there are some divisions on these issues in the left. But I mean, for me, those would be the three things: universalism, democracy, and environmentalism, that you could form I think, a really good, deep, progressive alignment on in this country and maybe beyond.
Great, thanks a lot. I wanted to pick up on what you said, I think was your second point about the breakdown of the working class, because I think that's a really key issue afflicting the left, not only in the United States, perhaps particularly in the United States, but really across the industrialized and post-industrial world, and also I think one of the major challenges facing the center left, for example, in Germany. I think the objective fact that the working class is breaking down is undeniable. I would be curious to hear both of your thoughts on what that means for left strategy, and specifically what it also means for the role of trade unions, historically probably the most important component of the left coalition, so to speak. Does the breakdown of the working class, is this an irreversible process? Can now only revert to some kind of constellation alliance or mosaic left, as it's often referred to in German language debates, or is rebuilding class identity and class power, does that have to be at the core of any left project? Megan, why don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come down on the side of absolutely it needs to be the working class identity, working class politics need to be rebuilt and can. In terms of labor unions, we have to be incredibly honest about the dire situation that we're facing. We're not going to get anywhere unless we're incredibly honest about the fact that it looks really bad. The labor movement in the United States already represented at its peak a minority of working class people in their workplaces. And now that's been, worse than, halved and then halved again. So it's really critical that we rebuild the labor movement. And in order to do that, we need to do new organizing and we need to democratize our unions. You guys are frozen. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, I see you again. I'll continue. Okay. So we have our work cut out for us in the labor movement. I think it's really critical for the labor movement to actually start functioning again like a movement. There are a couple of key principles to this. One is I think that unions need to be democratized. We need to move away from a business union model and a service union model, where the idea is that the union is a separate party that you sort of pay for the services of, and it makes your sort of work life experience a little bit better, like it's an add-on that you purchase, right? And move toward the idea that a union is something that you belong to, that you make up along with your coworkers and along with people who work in other job sites in your same industry and so on. And that is possible with a pretty major initiative. The main initiative that I'm thinking of is that we need to have good activists inside of the unions on a rank and file level. There are people in the United States who are, young, enthusiastic, progressive, and socialist activists are intentionally taking jobs in nodes are strong but can be improved, and that is sometimes as the rank and file strategy. I don't know if it's currently happening on a scale to make a difference, but that's certainly the direction that you would want to go in, I think. But it's not just labor. I mean, I think that we also have to engage in what you might call a process of class formation, also in the political sphere, and that to that end, I think that our candidates, progressive left-wing candidates, we have special responsibilities when it comes to electoral campaigning and special tasks that we need to perform. So I think that you could break these down into three categories. When you're campaigning, this goes also for when you're governing, though there are separate criteria for that. But when you're campaigning, I think that you need to, one, work on raising the expectations of the working class, which have been so successfully managed by neoliberalism. In fact, neoliberalism, sort of one of its primary characteristics is its tendency to manage the expectations of the working class for what kind of society it might reasonably expect to be able to live in. Right. You could see this, obviously, the famous Thatcherism, there is no alternative. The theorist Mark Fisher often called it capitalist realism, the idea that there genuinely is not another option. If I recall, when Thatcher said there is no alternative, she wasn't making a case for why her her austerity policies were in fact better. She was simply saying, I think that that, and I know that this is how it's going to be from now on. So you might as well adjust to it, right? And so what we have to do is we have to run candidates whose job is to raise expectations. Now, I think that there's a particular strategy that you can employ to do that, and it's to identify policies that are about 2 steps ahead of popular consciousness, but not 20. If you go 20 steps ahead of where people actually are in terms of what they think they can expect, then you run the risk of actually disenchanting people or demoralizing them because it seems so infeasible. So, for example, I genuinely think that we should have not only an American NHS, but I think that we should eliminate profit from the healthcare sector literally entirely. That's my personal opinion. I think that Medicare for all is a perfect demand because that's just several steps ahead of where the American people's mind is currently at. Neoliberals have managed American working class people's expectations for what they can expect to the point where the public option seems like a radical policy to a lot of people. So we need to be raising expectations through policy and through rhetoric, of course. 2, I think that this is where class politics comes in. Democrats, so the Republicans in the United States are very good at dividing people up based on, race, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, obviously, and so on. Bitter division, that's kind of their specialty. In response, Democrats offer, I think, a false sense of harmony. It's like, well, we're all Americans and we all live in this society together, so just vote for us and we'll take care of it for everybody. And they paper over any kind of real conflict in society, right? So the Republicans are offering a false conflict and the Democrats are offering no conflict and actually essentially avoiding discussion of politics. And so what we need to do is actually talk about where the real conflicts do exist in society. The Democratic Party at present represents both Blackstone and people who are being evicted by corporate landlords like Blackstone. It represents both, Blue Cross Blue Shield and people whose medical claims are being denied by Blue Cross Blue Shield. And our responsibility as progressives is to actually heighten those contradictions. And if we can do that successfully, then we are going to be contributing to rebuilding class consciousness in the void that was created by McCarthyism and the evisceration of the American left and working class organizations in the 20th century. The 3rd criteria is really simple, I think, but deceptively so. Our candidates need to be building movements. It's almost like on a hike in a forest, sometimes you'll see a sign that says, like, leave this forest cleaner than you found it, right? The rule for candidates is that they need to be leaving movements stronger than they found them. And the actual campaign itself should be a movement building exercise. Because, too often candidates they'll have wonderful rhetoric and great policies, and then they'll get elected, and then they will not have, durable working class rooted institutions that they're liaising with, that they can take cues from, advice and sort of like be in dialogue with, and B, that can back them up when they try to do something radical, right? So those kinds of relationships between politicians or would-be politicians and movements are really critical to establish from the very outset, from the moment that a campaign is announced, and should be woven into the entire fabric of a campaign. And I think you can see how these principles extrapolate to governance itself as well, but I wanted to start with campaigning. But it's essentially the same set of principles for governance. And if we do that, I do think that we stand a chance of raising the level of class consciousness, raising awareness of the real contradictions in society and the real conflicts in society, instead of papering them over the way that the center left, or in our case, I think sometimes the center right, would like to do in the United States.
Well, Clive, how about from where you're standing? I mean, you're in a party called Labor, but at least some of the things that Megan's describing, it seems to me, are also reflected in the politics of Labor Party. So where do you see the role of the working class as sort of a foundation or a basis of center-left and progressive politics?
So it's massive, and I'd say it's not a binary choice. So one of the things I often talk about is something you call it a mosaic politics. I call it a progressive alliance, and that's progressive alliance is about acknowledging that the kind of what you would call progressive forces in our political system are siloed, are disunited, disjointed, and at the same time also acknowledging that there is a working class. The understanding of a working class consciousness has been eroded by the past 40 years. I think one of the caveats I will give to that is that there is a section of the left, and I often get accused of left bashing my own side sometimes on this, but there is a section of the left of a very often bureaucratic mentality who I think are stuck in aspic of seeing the working class as something almost that was, created at its inception 120 years ago, which is when the Labour Party was created, from a federation of different interest groups, most of which don't exist now, things like the temperance movement and others, that came together to form the Labour Party and to form the progressive class movement in this country, the Labour movement, as we call it. And I think sometimes some people get caught up with a kind of dewy-eyed look back to the past about how things were when we had manufacturing, when we had coal, and so on and so forth. And I think the reality is you have to see past that, and you have to understand that, yes, I think everything Megan said about class consciousness, that has to happen. That has to be built. But I also think when you look at the countervailing forces arrayed against us, when you look at the ticking clock of the climate and ecological crisis, it means that you need to make alliances that otherwise you perhaps, in an ideal world, wouldn't necessarily have to make. And that means working with others. It also means acknowledging the political system you're operating in and working out what it is you need to challenge those countervailing forces. And I look at those countervailing forces here in the UK. They're large, they're big, they're global. The culture of consumption, as Megan touched upon, of managing the expectations of the working class, of a media system which is controlled and dominated by them almost entirely, and then whatever independent ecosystem there is, especially in terms of social media, people think that's an independent platform. It's increasingly, well, it is. It's controlled by them as well, and increasingly those complex algorithms pushing us down certain dead ends in terms of how we communicate and talk and what we consider to be politically important. So I think we need to do both. I think that class consciousness has to be raised, but I also think we in this country, I can speak for the UK, we need a political mosaic. I have more in common with the Liberals and Greens than I do my class opponents, my class enemy, which is represented by the Conservative Party, which is capital. And to be able to take them on with the array of powers that they have at their disposal will require a bigger boat, or a bigger series of boats. I think one of the things that the Labour Party has done in this country is said, we are the way, we are the light. If you want to, you can't be a progressive unless you're on this ship. But actually what we need is a convoy, a flotilla of ships all heading in the same direction on the same purpose. And yes, some of us, those ships will look different, but they're all heading in the same direction with that single unity of purpose. And I think ultimately that's how I see us approaching this. And I think that has to happen, especially in the UK, because of our electoral voting system, which means that there can only be two parties. And historically, the Labour Party has been an opposition party. In the last century, we won just 8 out of 26 general elections. We are the official opposition, but we're hooked on that oppositionalism because we look over at other political parties, Greens, Lib Dems, none of the above, and we think, whoa, we're the official opposition. We get that short money from the state to be able to do that. I don't want to be them. I'd rather. So we're hooked on the trappings of oppositionalism, and actually we only win very infrequently. So I think actually we need to dream bigger, and we need to think, how do we actually begin to take on capital in a way that is sustainable and actually achieve something in a lasting way? And that means that there's going to have to be compromises. But it doesn't mean that you can't, go it alone once you get to that point and do your own thing. But I think to kind of stop and begin to move forwards, we're going to need both raising class consciousness of the working class, and we're going to need that mosaic to be able to challenge those countervailing forces that oppose us.
Speaking of countervailing forces, the topic of our discussion, or the official title, is actually Best Practices on Keeping Out the Center-Right. Both of our two speakers, you're both in pretty divergent situations politically, in the sense that in the United States, the center-right was recently kicked out of office. In the UK, their hold on power seems to be consolidating even more by the day. So before we run out of time, I'd like to ask both of you, but maybe we can start with your situation in the UK, Clive. How can the left, I guess in your case, first kick out the center-right, but then make sure that they don't scramble right back in?
I think the first thing to do is to acknowledge the scale of the scale of the defeat, the scale of the task ahead of us, to work out the scale of those countervailing forces and what it's going to require for us to be able to win. I think, secondly, it's about embracing democracy, deepening it, opening it out, understanding that the only way that we're going to do this isn't by having a loser's charter of trying to change the political voting system in this country, which is what a lot of people mistake changing the voting system to a more proportional system as being. You've got to have a platform for change. You've got to have a manifesto for radical change. You've got to connect to people. You've got to reawaken that working class consciousness. And you've got to put aside your differences as far as you can as progressives to find a platform, a manifesto, which can get you over the line. There are certain inbuilt mechanisms in the United Kingdom which overwhelmingly favour the Tories. The voting system is but one of them. Not having a written constitution is another. Strengthening the role of trade unions, democratising them, but giving them real powers in the workplace, democratising our workplaces. We live in a country, and I imagine many of you can empathise with this, where we so-called live in a so-called democracy, but as soon as you step over the threshold to work, you increasingly live in a dictatorship of capital, which ultimately needs to change. So I think if we're to take power back here in the United Kingdom, then we need a programme of change which all progressives can buy into. It won't be as radical as everyone wants. It will have to try to bring as many people as it can with it. And central to that will be the democratisation of our state, rebuilding. The United Kingdom was put there was basically created to run the empire. We're now a declining empire, post-empire nation. Brexit was a kind of function of that. Now we see Scotland wanting to break away. We as the Labour Party, we as progressives need to understand those changes and work out how we work with them to be able to drive and generate the kind of change that we want to see. You can't just fight against it, as I think we so often do on the left, to try and hold together what is pretty much a reactionary polity. So, I think it's about understanding that change is coming, and we on the left have to adapt and change to it. We can keep those traditions, we can keep that history, but we have to actually understand that to be able to take ourselves forward, we're going to have to adapt to the different circumstances that we find ourselves in.
How about over in the United States, Megan?
Yeah, in the United States, there is a strong consensus already around economic inequality. Like if you look at the polls, you'll see that much more, to a greater extent than is actually reflected in the way that people vote, because people vote in, for a variety of reasons and a variety of patterns, right? But to a greater extent than the vote totals would tell you, there is a large consensus that economic inequality is completely out of hand, right? And so the real problem for us is creating a consensus around its causes and its solutions. So we have, right-wing populists will say, the cause is immigration. Conservative, cultural conservatives will say that the cause is the, erosion of traditional values, which is leading to social breakdown, and then people are, becoming lazy, and that's why we have so much inequality and so on. Austerity-minded centrists, who are, I think, dominant in our political system, will say that actually the problem is, taxes and regulations and constraints on business growth are actually impeding capital's ability to invest in the economy, which is, putting up obstacles, economic obstacles for everybody, right? So what we have to do is that we have to work to convince millions of people that the problem that they already identify, that the reason for it is that our entire economic system is driven by the compulsive need to maximize profit, and that what's missing is, we need to engage in social spending on universal programs to eliminate the kind of economic dependency, to give people more freedom in their lives, and we need to actually pursue worker empowerment both in law and in practice, right? So like I said, we have a consensus on the root problem. We just don't have a consensus on the solution, and I think that's our main task as progressives. As for how we can do it, I'm going to hammer again something that I've mentioned several times, which is building durable institutions. This is something that is really missing in United States politics, and we suffer for it. And I'll give you an example of time recently that we suffered for it. So Bernie Sanders Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign, to a greater extent even than his 2016 campaign, I think kind of functioned almost as an ad hoc progressive political party. I mean, it really served all of the functions. It brought us all together. Different constituencies on the sort of progressive left were all in the same room. We had all of these, incredible and different ideas. We had each other's backs. We had a mission. We had an enemy. I mean, it felt like we belonged to a single political party called Bernie Sanders' temporary campaign that is about to end. And then once it ended, bam, like it felt like we were looking around and it was an illusion. We don't have an independent progressive political party in the United States. And we don't even have institutions that are like big and durable enough to serve that purpose in the absence of a campaign like that. And this was especially notable in the way that Bernie Sanders' campaign ended, which is that it collapsed, it nosedived right into the COVID crisis. And it would have been really nice, as we often noted, to have had Bernie Sanders running for president during the COVID crisis, because he would have been able to build that consensus on those solutions, like I just said, because it seemed like everybody in the United States understood that there was a consensus on the problems, right? I mean, we had mass unemployment, the highest unemployment that we've ever seen in the United States. And it seemed like there was incredible opportunity, but we couldn't seize that opportunity because the Bernie Sanders campaign was defunct. It was no longer active, and we didn't have a replacement. And so that should be we should take that as a sign that our task is to build a replacement, to build something that can actually serve that purpose and not just rely on campaigns, temporary campaigns. Now, I think that the Bernie Sanders campaigns and various other sort of smaller scale campaigns for Congress and local office and things like that have given us good opportunities to lay the groundwork for that kind of institution building. For example, my organization, the Democratic Socialists of America, went from 6,000 members who were essentially holdovers, most of them from the 1980s, to now we're pushing 100,000 members. It's really incredible, and we've got elected officials all over the country, and that's something that happened in the wake of the Bernie Sanders campaign. So we're seeing, and you've got Sunrise Movement, and you've got Justice Democrats, and things that are more on the progressive rather than the Democratic Socialist side of things are also starting to do this kind of institution building. So I think we need to push that, because that's what's really missing in American politics. And until we get that groundwork laid, we're going to constantly be seeing these boom and busts, and we're not going to be able to form that kind of consensus in a moment when the American people are actually really going to be receptive to it. Moments of crisis that are going to continue to come over and over and over again.
All right, we're almost out of time, but I'd like to give both of you just a chance just to make a couple concluding remarks. We're at the Progressive Governance Summit. The project of this gathering is not only to compare the, granted, extremely interesting situations in the United States and the UK, but also try to talk about some more general direction and lessons for the center-left across Europe and across the world. So maybe just in closing, if I could get both of you just to give a couple of thoughts on what do you think political activists, political parties, the center-left and the progressive movement, broadly speaking, what are some key points that they have to perform or that they have to do to secure and maintain progressive majorities in the coming decade? Clive?
So I think, to kind of sum up, it's slightly different in each country. I think I can't overemphasize how much I agree with Megan about institution building. I think that's a critical factor in being able to have a sustainable left, which can actually achieve, and also ensuring that when you do get representatives in positions of power, they have accountability and a support base that's there. I think that's a critical factor. I think also as well, understanding that you need to look at the opposition that faces you, the scale, the challenge, and try to match your forces in accordance with that. And I think one of the things is that you will need to go outside of your comfort zone to be able to achieve certain objectives in terms of how far you want to dilute what it is you're saying. And look, all political organizations, movements, Megan's has done that already, and they've benefited from it. And I think that's something you need to understand, that working with others doesn't necessarily always dilute you. I mean, the fact that they would have had to make compromises to be part of the Bernie Sanders campaign on certain areas, there have been certain parts of policy they didn't like, but they did that. There's been a payback for them, and I think we need to understand that working with others and compromising can produce benefits. I think the last thing to say, and something we haven't touched on, is that whatever I do in this country, whatever Megan does in her country, although it does have slightly more impact given the scale of the American economy, one of the things that's been missing from this conversation is internationalism. And I think with the COVID pandemic, we can see, and I think one of the things I would say on closing is the need for internationalism in a way that I think for a long time on the left, it's been a kind of a word that we drop in that's quite flamboyant and it kind of gives you some left credential. But actually, one of the things we can see with COVID, with the climate and ecological crisis, is that to make a difference how many leftist groups come to power inside the United Kingdom or in Europe, unless we can link that up internationally, unless we can begin to understand that we are going to have to communicate to our own electorates the need for us to change the way that we live, to bring justice to the last 400 years of imperialism and colonialism that has in so many ways impacted on the climate and ecological crisis and those who are being affected by it, to technology transfers, to changing the way we live. Now, that's probably 20 steps ahead, as Megan said, but nonetheless, we need to start stepping in that direction, because unless we understand that class is banded, I have more in common with someone in the US and someone in India than, a middle-class person in India, working-class person in India than I do with Boris Johnson or the millionaires and billionaires in my own country. That's self-evident to many of us, but not to everyone. So I think understanding that so many of the solutions that confront us are going to be global solutions. And that means as well building the institutions, the democratic institutions that can take on the power of capital. And that does require an international approach and perspective. I just wanted to get that in there before we close. Sorry.
In the United States, I think socialists and progressives really need to not be afraid to run our own homegrown activists for office. And I think also we need to not be afraid to primary centrist Democrats from the left and to challenge centrist Democrats on their conciliatory posture toward capital and toward Republicans when in office, as a means of helping to cultivate an independent, progressive, and left-wing political expression in the United States. So in the absence for immediate party building in the United States, I also think that we need to build independent left-wing political organizations that can, like I said earlier, function as kind of party surrogates, performing some of the functions of parties like running candidates, organizing members, building ties to labor, and doing mass political education. And ideally, the hope is that these organizations can develop loyal constituencies, can help raise the expectations of the working class and unite the working class, can elevate, political understanding and class consciousness. And then one day we hope that one of them can be successful enough to confidently break away from the Democratic Party and really create a multi-party democracy in the United States.
Great. Thanks a lot. I want to thank Clive and Megan for taking the time today for this discussion. My name again was Lauren Bellhorn from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and the Progressive Governance Summit will be back at 5:30 on the topic of intergenerational justice and social mobility post-COVID.